the police, even where they have, a good number of officers, they're spending more time on issues that previously wouldn't really have been, considered something that the police should get involved in.
Welcome to the IEA Podcast. Each week, this podcast asks a tantalising policy question to tackle one of the key challenges facing the UK or even the world. This week's question: how do we tackle crime? Joining me to answer it is the IEA's very own Research Assistant Dan Freeman. Although I would say we come from quite different strands of the classical liberal umbrella, we have definitely discussed and found some common ground on this particular issue recently, and it is most certainly a very pertinent issue at the moment, as we were reminded earlier this week with some of the violence at the Notting Hill Carnival and the government's promise to enforce the laws they should already have been enforcing in some of these circumstances. So Dan, thank you very much for joining me to continue that
thanks
discussion.
For having me on, and I'm very glad you've moved closer to my more sensible position
Naturally.
on this.
Indeed. And I hope you'll move to some of my more sensible positions in future.
Do you have any sensible positions?
Not too many, to be honest, but we'll get there. So to start off with, what exactly has happened in the UK with crime over the last decade or so?
Well, I think on this, it's important not to get too trapped up in kind of America brain, which I know is a chronic issue for you, but also across British politics, is to assume that because there are certain trends going on in America, you can exactly transfer that to Britain, which isn't necessarily the case when it comes to crime. So in America, what we've seen in the last 2 years, really since the George Floyd killing and the protests and riots which followed that, is you saw a dramatic increase in violent crime, particularly homicides, up by about 30%. And that has been sustained. It's starting to come down a bit now. But we haven't really seen that in Britain. In Britain, we're, in terms of homicides, we basically are roughly where we were before the pandemic. So you're getting about 600-ish murders each year, which is very bad, and it's much higher than the murder rate we had in, say, 1960, but it's lower than some of the rates that we might have had in the early 2000s, for example. And overall, most crime has been coming sort of slowly down from a peak in the mid-1990s, and that applies to a lot of other Western countries. But often people who are, who talk about this often go, well, look, crime is somewhat lower than it was in the early 90s, therefore that's great. Well, it's better than it was, but the 1990s come as a kind of peak after about 3 decades of very substantial increases in the amount of crime, especially violent crime. So it's not terrible, but we could do significantly better.
Absolutely. And what is incredibly frustrating about this particular sort of spike in reports of crime, at least, is police inaction. The police being rather ineffective. I'm particularly thinking with burglaries and bike thefts. I think it's under 5% of bike thefts are even fully investigated, never mind actually solved. And nobody our age can live in London without knowing someone who's experienced their phone getting stolen, even a mugging, and the police just giving them a report number to give to their insurance company and then doing very little else. This is something that's been going on for a fair few years, at least you see anecdotal reports of it, but now it's becoming very, very difficult to ignore. Why are the police not doing the very basic functions of their job?
That's a really good question. I think part of it is that what is seen as their job is continuously expanding. So, Parliament continues to pass more and more laws, and there are areas that 20 years ago no one would have thought of as being the police's job. So, part of it, we see quite a bit of this, is social media. So, 25, 30 years ago, Facebook did not exist. But beyond that, there was also not a belief that the police are there to kind of investigate people having arguments online and using, or making, very off-color jokes. And so you have the police, even where they have, a good number of officers, they're spending more time on issues that previously wouldn't really have been, considered something that the police should get involved in.
And as this issue with crime has become impossible to ignore, there has been, thankfully, quite a strong discourse springing up around it of people proposing ideas about what to do to try and contain it, to try and stop it. And most of that energy has been on the right, with people like Ed West, for example. He bangs on about this all the time and does it very well. But one of the areas I think where, sort of free market and classical liberal voices can come in and really be constructive on this issue is the one you just described, which is there are way too many laws. And they are, and not only is that a bad thing, morally, nobody likes to see, what was it, something like 10 policemen going to take that poor girl in Leeds away for allegedly implying that one of the police women looked like a lesbian. Nobody wants to see that. It's profoundly unjust. But also, I'm sure there's a lot of stuff going on at night in Leeds that those 10 cops could be attending to. They are, there's an opportunity cost to that. What type of laws beyond sort of just speech restrictions and the like could we perhaps be looking at again to get rid of, so that, the police do their basic job, which is to protect life and property?
Yeah, well, I mean, what you could look at is laws around the possession of at least some drugs. Now, you can make the case that sort of not a huge, there aren't huge numbers of people in prison today because they've been caught with, a small bag of cannabis. Yeah. That's, and even in America, that is largely a myth.
Indeed.
But if possession is still treated as a criminal offence, you are having police who have to record this, who if they find people in possessions of drugs, they have to spend time taking them down to the police station. And over time this sort of thing adds up. So it might be, regardless of your position on legalization of drugs overall, which you're broadly in favour of.
Very much so.
I'm a bit more sceptical about. If you start to basically take an approach that you say drugs under a certain amount, we're just not going to treat it as a police matter.
Yeah.
That might be something that politicians could look at, so that the police can actually spend their time dealing with bike thefts, muggings, burglaries, the things we really can all agree are bad and we want to suppress.
Precisely. And often when classical liberals, libertarians, free marketers talk about crime, it is in the context of the police often do very bad and violent things, particularly in the US. It's much less of a problem, police violence in the UK, so to speak. But it's about, the state can be very violent as well. It often puts laws into place which are, just as which victimise people just as much as perhaps criminals do. But what, as you say, literally everyone agrees on, regardless of their political ideology, to like 90% of an extent, is that people shouldn't be allowed to go around murdering people and just nicking their stuff.
Muggings,
stabbing's bad. A point of unity, I think, for everybody.
Although shoplifting is a kind of
don't get me started on that. That's another great example of where you just do see loads of reports of the police doing very little, even when people have CCTV footage of the person that's come in. Likewise, we mentioned phone thefts, where you have Find My iPhone data saying it's there, and the police are just like, no, I can't do anything about that, mate.
Yeah,
there does seem to be as you say, it must be because they're overstretched. Like, I'm sure these policemen want to go and catch criminals. That's why they become policemen most of the time. But when it comes to the impact of violent crime, whether it be things like theft and fraud, but also just brute violence like murder or mugging, the impacts go far beyond the specific victim of a case, doesn't it? And I think it's that we need to sell to people who are broadly of a liberal disposition, whether they completely agree with us or not. Yeah. That those effects are profoundly, just an awful drain on society writ large as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's a theory that certainly in the US and to a lesser extent in Britain, one of the big contributors to NIMBY sentiment is essentially displaced fear of crime.
Yes.
So that people feel that if we permit more affordable housing to be built near us, it's going to lead to more bike thefts, more muggings, that kind of thing. And if there's a perception that the police aren't really going to do anything about that, then the only way that people can feel as if they can defend themselves against that is by saying, oh well, we don't want anyone from outside coming into our area.
Yeah.
And so it has knock-on effects like that.
Absolutely. And I guess there could be, just as there is the housing theory of everything, a crime theory of everything as well, right? And the impacts are wide-ranging and long-reaching.
Well, there's Ben Southwald's piece in Works in Progress.
There is a crime theory of everything.
Well, I'm not sure. I don't think he quite called it.
Put that in the description.
But it's essentially, he estimated that the total annual cost to the US economy of crime overall is about $2.6 trillion. Part of that is simply, people having their stuff nicked, which is bad on its own level. But a lot of that is things like people moving out of cities, private security that's become increasingly prevalent in wealthier areas in America, and it just contributes to a serious economic problems that you can't just ignore and say, oh well, this is something for those mean conservatives to think about. Free marketeers, we should just be thinking about the top rate of corporation tax. Which, don't get me wrong,
should be as well.
We should be
big
thinking
drain on the
about
economy too.
Should be thinking about that as well. But some of these more basic issues are really important, and at a basic level, having your phone nicked at knife point is a huge invasion of property rights.
Massively.
So, free marketers should have a stance on it.
Yes, and I'd certainly say that change in mentality has definitely occurred with me, whereby my general disposition is to be very suspicious of the state. I think it's sort of quite a violent, damaging entity in and of itself. But just as I think people who are too far on the tough on crime scale maybe forget that the state can be incredibly violent and oppressive too, so do people on the far wet on crime scale forget that criminals and gangs are brutal
Yeah.
and oppressive
Mm.
and damaging, and that
Yeah.
we ought not forget that,
Mm.
and we ought not close our minds to ideas that will actually change that. And
Yeah, I think part of the issue is that people have sort of, many people on both sides of this issue, both in Britain and America, have kind of conflated the idea of being anti-crime with being pro-police in every
yes,
aspect. And so there's sort of an assumption from some on the right that, oh, well, we think crime is really, really bad. Okay, fair enough. And there are these lefties who are less concerned about it, and they hate the police. And therefore, we need to back the police
Yes.
on everything. They're great, they're heroes. There's no issues, of abuse of power or just incompetence. Whereas I think that's a really mistaken position. If you do want to deal with crime, you have to have a police force that is properly scrutinised
Yes.
and is good at its job.
Absolutely.
And expecting that of the police is not the same as being sort of pro-crime.
Absolutely. And that sort of raises the question quite nicely: what do we do to stop this? How can we change policy, whether it's small-scale stuff or broad-scale philosophical changes to the way we police, to try and sort of nip this in the bud before it becomes an even bigger issue?
Yeah, so over the last 50 plus years, there have been lots of ideas circulating among police forces, among criminologists, sociologists about, what exact strategy do we need to fight crime? Do swimming pools help, or more youth clubs, or this one particular tactic that the police should use? Whereas the evidence for a lot of this is quite mixed. What does have very strong evidence behind it, from lots of studies, is that basically having more police about on the streets
Yes.
brings down crime.
Yeah.
You don't have to sort of think that police are all brilliant heroes who are, never make a mistake. But the evidence is very, very clear that when generally about a 10% increase in police on the beat usually leads to about a 4% reduction in violent crime, or thereabouts. There are some studies that suggest it's even higher. So that's one thing, having the physical presence of police about.
That's one thing where we agree with general political platitudes, right? It's a
Yeah.
popular promise to go around saying we're going to put more bobbies on the beat. Well, yes, actually, that's good. Can you actually do that and make them very visible and target them in high crime areas?
Yeah. So it is actually one of these, in inverted curve situations where you've got the sort of middle position, which is like, oh no, it's much more complicated than that.
We need swimming pools.
Yeah, it's, oh no, you need to pursue broken window policing or this type, or community-led. No, you basically just need more police about, and that will, all things being equal, lower crime. And another thing is, basically, for violent crime, prison does work. In terms of the very substantial majority of violent crime is committed by a really quite small number of people, who commit crime over and over again, and prison isn't very good at reforming people. There's not much evidence it does a good job for convincing people not to do crimes, but it is very good at basically stopping repeat offenders repeatedly offending.
Yes.
And the big thing that actually reduces recidivism is basically just age.
Yeah.
Like, as people get into the primarily, as men, primarily who do the vast majority of crime, get into their 30s, they tend to do less of it. And so basically, if you have someone who is repeatedly committing crimes over and over again, basically putting them in prison does kind of work.
Yeah, and it's not always a nice thought to think that there are this small group of repeat offenders who, for the most part, just not interested in being, peaceful, contributing members of society that just will often commit crime. But it does seem to be true. It's called power law of crime, isn't it? And was something that really struck me, especially when it was Owen Jones on Good Morning Britain this week talking about, youth services, youth clubs, swimming pools, they've all been cut, funding for that's been cut by 3/4.
Yeah.
That's behind the rise in crime. Okay, fair point, but I think the power law of crime, the one of the strongest studies we've had into whether this is a real thing so far is a large study of Sweden between, is it 1975 and 2004, something like that?
Is this the one where it shows sort of 1%?
Yeah,
account for about 70% of all.
Yeah, I think
crime.
it's in the low 60s, but it's still absolutely massive. And Sweden, I think, Owen Jones would admit, is somewhere that has a pretty good funding for social services and a safety net, and it's also a very peaceful society where people sort of get along and be lefties together, and yet still you observe this effect. And even in the United States, where crime is much wider and social services are a bit more patchy, even there, and you still have this small group of people, and I think again it's something in the low 60s of second and third and fourth and fifth and so on time offences and convictions.
Yeah.
That in the entire year, 63% of them or something like that are the total number of convictions are second, third, fourth time offences.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I think this idea that it's necessarily social services and poverty and unemployment that leads people to commit crime, or that there are lots of people who are who otherwise wouldn't commit crime repeatedly, who are start doing it because social services are cut, just doesn't really map on to the evidence that actually exists historically. So you see crime rates which in Britain and America had been very, very low throughout most of the mid-20th century, start to tick up dramatically in the 1960s. And this is not a time of high unemployment and few social services. This is a time where employment is, at an all-time low. More money is being poured into, social services and programs in urban areas. And yet crime starts to tick up, and then it continues to tick up through the 1970s at roughly the same rate as it had before. And then, you can say, but 70s, lots of economic problems, lots of unemployment. But then you get into the 80s and it keeps ticking up, and it keeps ticking up basically until the early 90s. And then it starts to steadily tick down. And it even ticks down, continues ticking down in the UK after 2010, after we get loads of cuts to youth clubs and local government funding, but it doesn't seem to have had that much impact on crime. It continues ticking down. So it seems there are other factors. Now, you can still say youth clubs are great. You can still say, publicly funding swimming pools are great to have and all that. That's fair enough. But I think it's difficult to sustain the argument that this is the main driving force behind crime.
Absolutely,
it's not.
But it wouldn't necessarily be right to say that there are zero social causes of crime, that there will be plenty of people who, if you stuck that exact same individual in a very different set of circumstances, or even if they had just avoided one or two wrong turns in their life, things might be a bit different. And there are a lot of theories about how this could be, and to what extent these things are, social causes of crime, and when they sort of become embedded in people. But things like whether it's about poverty, whether it's, unemployment seems to be, that was one I always thought was pretty nailed on, that higher unemployment and higher crime were very, very closely related. Apparently it's the case that they're not. Whether it's unemployment, whether it's poverty, whether it's fatherlessness, for example, whether it's the high levels of lead in the air in the 60s and 70s is what I've seen recently as well. Do you think that any of these theories have quite a lot of explanatory value? And is there something in any of them? And in that sense, does it actually even matter? Is it still the case of like, well, maybe fatherlessness has given you a higher propensity towards committing crime, but unfortunately, we still just have to stop these people reoffending and contain them in prisons?
I think that's a really interesting point, because what you do tend to find, both on the left and the right, is a desire to try and pin crime on the issue that they already cared a lot about.
Indeed.
So if you're on the right, and if you're a sort of conservative and you're very upset about family breakdown and divorce and fatherlessness, you can say, yes, well, clearly this is the issue that's leading to crime. So we just need to deal with my pet issue, and then we'll deal with crime. And on the left, you get that, as with Owen Jones. But the evidence for all of these, as far as I can tell, is quite weak as an explainer. Like, fatherlessness did not dramatically decline in Britain and the US in the 1990s. Like,
indeed.
But crime has, especially in the US, like the murder rate declined dramatically.
It's staggering.
From the early 1990s through to the mid 2010s. Then it started to sort of plateau, and now it's taking back up again. But there are various theories. It is interesting that across a lot of Western countries, the early 1990s is kind of the point at which crime starts to come down, and there are various theories. So there's Levitt's idea about taking the lead out of the petrol.
Yes.
That's possible, but it's also probably where populations are older now. So if you have a smaller percentage of the population which is teenage and in their early 20s, you're almost certainly just going to have less crime to start with. That doesn't explain all of it, but I think it's part of it. On top of that, you also just have, there is more stuff for young people to do at home now. So if you go back to the early 1990s or late 80s, if you're like a teenage boy and you have a load of time off in the summer, you can stay at home and watch daytime TV. You could read, or if you're not into that, you can go and hang around on the streets. Whereas now, you also have, the internet and PlayStation and other stuff that is more appealing.
Yeah.
And
though it doesn't seem like it, a lot more opportunities to pursue what you like for a living, for example. And education as well.
Yeah, and means you're less likely to be hanging around on the street, basically.
Yeah. Well, that's very good, and a lot of sort of food for thought there. The question of how we're going to start to tackle this is one that seems, I think, to have some pretty simple answers to it, but that inevitably means that they won't adopt any of them. So there you go. Dan, thank you very, very much for joining me. And thanks
for having me.
And thank you all very much for watching. If you enjoyed that podcast, please give it a like. And if you would like to see more from the IEA's YouTube channel, please subscribe to IEA London. Thank you very much.